Good day, everyone, and welcome to Dev Chats, the podcast where we talk with developers in our community to figure out how they make games. I am your host, Groutlover2 of Wait Gaming, and I am happy to welcome our first guests, the developers of The Pirate's Fate, Volkenfox and TF Wright of Fox Wright Productions. You all want to say hi?
Hello.
Hey.
Sweet. So, before we get too far into anything, a quick disclaimer for anybody listening. In the interest of transparency, I did do some work personally on The Pirate's Fate during the later stages of it. This was done on a voluntary basis and was no way affiliated with Wait Gaming in any way. So, let's get into it with some introductions. Let's start off with TF first.
What kind of introduction were you looking for? Like an introduction
Just
to
a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So I wanted to make games. I knew I wanted to make games when I was a kid. I did a little sidetrack when I first became an adult. I worked in politics for a while. And I kind of did writing as a hobby. And over the years, I kind of turned it from a hobby into kind of a part-time job. I wrote about 50 ebooks. Towards the end of that, Volkenfox and I collaborated. We did some illustrated stories together. And then after that, we decided let's make a game. I did the writing and the coding for The Pirate's Fate, at least the part of the coding that we didn't have help with, because I definitely did not know how to do coding before this project.
I don't think a lot of people do before they start getting into it.
Yes. So that's me.
Okay. Vulcan, how about you?
Sure. So I'm Volkenfox. I've been drawing and posting online for a good 10 years at this point. I like TF, I had always wanted to make games, but having no background in coding, and only a little experience with writing and the like, is one of those things that was a pipe dream for a long time. And when we first started a couple years ago, we started making illustrated stories. We quickly learned that, there was an interest in seeing more long form stories telling the kind of subjects that we cover, typically, issues related to transformation, weight gain, muscle growth, personality changes, etc. And so we kept trying to do bigger and bigger projects until, we eventually launched a Kickstarter for The Pirate's Fate. And, good, 18 months of development later, we ended up, releasing a full game on Steam. And now I guess I would identify myself as both an artist and a developer at this point. So
very nice.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to get the story on how you two actually got together, because I know from my personal experience, I first saw you guys starting to collaborate on your Patreon stories, which were very excellent, by the way. So what's the story behind how you guys got together and kind of decided to try to actually work together? Because it seems like that's fairly rare within this community.
People working together?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people tend to work more on individual projects. There's only a few that I can count on at least my hands that seem to work collaboratively, consistently on larger projects.
Originally, I was doing a short story commission, and Volkenfox was a commission client for a few stories. And then I think the first time we ever did something collaboratively was he commissioned me to write a story, and then I think in exchange for like a discount on the story, he did a really beautiful cover for the story, and the story was called Going Bananas. It was a human to anthro transformation. And then at some point after that, we had the idea of actually doing like an illustrated story together.
Yeah, it's one of the things that was going on my end at the time was I always liked the idea of collaborating with people, and So we had done, I did the cover for Going Bananas and the like, and I ended up kind of exploring some other alternatives. About a year earlier, I tried doing a comic collaboration with a few artists for a Halloween special. And, I want to say that January before we started doing Patreon stories, I actually did my first long form illustrated story collaboration with a different writer, Kotep, for a story called Heart's Desire. And that was really my first experience where I really went, it's enjoyable to combine strengths together. And TF and I have a lot of common interests and ideas, and we have a good rapport. So, one day we just decided to try doing this. It was around the time that a lot of other artists were doing their own Patreons and the like. And, I had spent a bunch of time looking at what types of approaches they were doing. Some people do comics, some people treat Patreon as a form of doing commissions. And some people just, have it as, general fun to support larger projects in general, get early access and so forth. And I thought it would be a little different to try to use it as almost like a little mini crowdfunders to make individual stories.
And how well did that kind of work out for you guys? I think it seemed like it worked fairly well in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we did a lot of stories together. I think we did like 11 different illustrated projects together. And the game, obviously, we have different sets of talents. And so we were able to combine those. We have different talents, but we have similar interests. So we were able to combine those and create a project. I'm very happy with how the Pirates Fate turned out overall. Obviously, since it's their first project, I can look back on it and I could just think like, well, there's these things I wish I could have done differently, having known the experience of making a game. But for a first attempt, I feel very proud. It has been generally warmly received by the community. It's an over 90% score on Steam. We've been nominated for 2 awards. So yeah, I feel very proud of what we did.
Very nice. So that actually gives us a good segue where for those who might be listening that don't know much about the Pirates Fate, would you take some time to kind of explain that for them?
Sure. The Pirates Fate is a visual novel experience where you play as Mila, who is a character who wakes up on a pirate ship. She's not sure how she's got there. And you're on this journey to collect these magical coins that cause transformations of all kinds. Weight gain, muscle growth, species change, gender change, age changes, even changes in time itself. And the adventure will have you question your sense of identity, question your sense of morality, right and wrong. Lots of romances, lots of action. It is a choose your own adventure game, unlike any other choose your own adventure game, because there's over 300 choices, over 8 unique plot paths. So it really allows you to guide the action rather than essentially just replaying the same experience but hunting for like a different ending or something. So yeah, Volk, is there something you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it was our attempt to try to turn our type of storytelling into a game format. And so we borrowed pages from the visual novel format and predominantly from the choose your own adventure format. It's a heavily illustrated, heavily varied choice system, like TF had mentioned. A lot of games say that your choices matter. One of the approaches we took to the Pirates Fate is that we literally diverge the entire plot line based on certain choices that you would make in the game. So, we try to have fun with the consequences of the player's actions, whether they are intended or not.
Very interesting. Okay, so now that we've kind of got the introductions kind of out of the way a little bit, to go over a quick overview of what's going to be covered, we're first going to go over kind of the concept, how this idea came to you guys first, and what you kind of did to see if this was feasible or not. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how you guys handled your pre-production, how development went for you guys, how you handled the release, and then any retrospective and future plans that you guys may wish to actually talk about. So first, let's start off with the concept. My first question when it comes to this is, you kind of already answered it a little bit when you were explaining the Pirate's Fate. But what made you guys go with a visual novel? Was it just because it seemed like that was the easiest to adapt to your storytelling structure, as you guys were kind of already saying, or were there other reasons for choosing that type of format for a game?
Well, the first and foremost thing that was important to us was we are not programmers. We can write and we can draw and we can try to market and all of that. But so we needed a genre style that fit the type of labor that we can actually output. Visual novels worked really well because they were only one logical step away from just doing an illustrated story anyway. Except instead of just a bunch of panels embedded in text, it's text at the bottom, pictures at the top. You're clicking through them and then adding in a choice mechanism, or at least that's kind of where we had started with it. The other element of it, obviously, too, is that because a visual novel lives and dies by the writing and the art, as opposed to how thoroughly it's coded beyond, obviously, base level, we felt more confident, using, say, pre-made engines. One of the first ones that we actually had approached way back at the demo days was Rando Builder, for example. And the question was, could we make a game without needing to do anything outside of what these commercial engines came prepackaged with?
So it's fair to say then it was also a combination of just trying to play to your strengths as an artist and a writer, and the lack of just some technical talent, like a experienced programmer, that kind of pushed you guys that way.
Yeah.
Okay. That actually brings up an interesting question I'd like to hear your guys' view on. If you didn't have those technical limitations, let's say one of you was an experienced programmer, would you have still went the VN route, or was there another type you were considering if you didn't have those limitations?
Well, Volk and I have talked about lots of different things that we might be interested in, like making a card game. I've expressed interest in wanting to make an RPG that gets away from the mathy component of it. There is one idea we talked about for Pirate's Fate was making more of an open world approach, so that you can kind of wander around freely instead of essentially just having a bunch of scripted scenes. So yeah, I recently played the game Life is Strange, and there are a lot of elements of that game that I like. But obviously we can't make a game like that because that was a team of 24 people,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that there's a lot that we could consider. It just kind of depends what additional skills are we picking up. If I knew I could make a game like Life is Strange, I'd be like, oh yeah, let's just do that. If it was more art stuff that we were getting, I would say, okay, why not have all the transformations be fully animated sequences?
Yep, that makes sense.
Plus, there's a bunch of other elements that, so some of it isn't even just coding. Some of it's just time as well. So animation would be an example of that. Because there were like other, TF briefly mentioned the idea of trying to avoid making it too math driven, but, there are other elements too, like, that. So for example, from a coding perspective, adding a point and click element to a game would not be an extremely further step forward in terms of technical complexity, but it would be a lot more work. And then, of course, obviously, game design questions come into play about whether that would be worth doing or not. But, we were throwing out all sorts of ideas. Essentially, what we wanted to do was just try to find different mechanics that would be conducive to telling, a good, character piece, especially for something that revolves around transformation.
Very interesting. Okay. So, from that on to my next question. I know, from a combination of what was kind of put out on the Patreon and just personal discussions with you that the Pirates phase kind of changed. I don't want to say drastically, but a lot more than you would probably think through the concept and pre-production phase. Because if I remember correctly, you guys were originally just thinking of doing a small little free online visual novel. So I want to ask you a little bit, what was your original view of the Pirates Fate when you were first kind of kicking around this idea?
We had a vote that we put out to our Patreon supporters of which idea to do. And it was actually tied between the Pirates Fate and another idea. And I remember actually telling Volk, I was like, let's just do the Pirates Fate first because that will be our test game,
Yeah, we had originally planned to do it in only 1 month too, or a couple months. There's one just general Patreon cycle.
This will be the game that will teach us how to make games, and then we'll make the real game. And then what happened was, I don't know if this was just because people wanted a game or if it was because the Pirates Fate itself was such a good idea, that people started to get really, really excited. People wanted to give us a lot of support on Kickstarter, on other platforms. We had someone approach us and say, this is an idea that's just too good to give away for free. You should be putting this on Steam, and I'll even help you set that up. So we essentially had to talk about that, and we're like, you know what? We're kind of like, we're on fire right now in terms of the amount of support and energy that this idea has got. We can't just turn away from that and say, well, that wasn't the plan. It's like, if this is going so much better than we thought, we should just make this the real game. And so, we did that. And then the second level, what happened was we set up a bunch of stretch goals for Kickstarter, and I think we hit almost every single one of them. And that dramatically changed the scope of the game. It ended up becoming much bigger than we thought.
Yeah, I believe that you guys didn't hit either the very last one or the very last two. But I'm not totally certain on that. I know you almost got all of them, though.
Yeah, it was all but the last one, which was the animation. And so when we realized that, we had thought, okay, at that point, we'll make the game in 6 months. So essentially, I remember Volk and I having another chat about that. And we're like, should we really rush the game to be ready in 6 months? Or should we tell people that we're just going to make a good game, but it's going to take a lot longer? And we decided to make a good game that would take longer. It ended up taking a lot longer than we thought because, first of all, we underestimated exactly how much work it would take. That was the first thing. The second thing is we had some technical problems that were not really our fault. And that ended up slowing us down by a few months, unfortunately. So the combination of inexperience in terms of estimating how much work the actual work would be and the technical issues ended up adding several months of development time. So it ended up being over a year longer. It ended up being 13 months longer than our Kickstarter initially estimated it. But at the same time, when I think about it, I'm like, well, it ended up taking 19 months when, we thought it was going to take 6 months. It's actually not that bad because I know there are some people who have done Kickstarters for games and it's like 5 years later and the game still isn't done.
Yeah, it's a very common pitfall that even experienced developers fall into. It's notoriously hard to kind of estimate the a time frame for projects, especially code, because there always seems to be some weird thing that pops up that delays you much longer than you originally expect.
I think the statistic is that 1/3 of all projects on Kickstarter that are successfully funded have not completed what they said they were going to do within 5 years. And I thought about that. I was like, that's just incredibly sad to me that they got the money, they have the team, and yet they didn't do it. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying we should be patting ourselves on the back because we at least finished with something, but I have to sort of weigh two things in my head. On the one hand, it took us so much longer than we thought, but on the other hand, I do feel that in the grand scheme of things, because we created such a big game that we actually we did bust our tails to finish it in a reasonable amount of time, considering.
Well, the other thing that also was an important factor for us was when we started on Patreon, it was just going to be the free idea. We were thinking, maybe 2 hours worth of gameplay. Then when we started on Kickstarter, we were thinking maybe we would shoot for 6 to 8 if we were successfully funded. And we went way beyond our initial estimate too. We added in a lot more content, both immediately, like after we had funding and we started hitting those stretch goals, but also in the middle of the development process, we were noticing that there were good opportunities to insert things. So, for example, when we had originally started, it had the whole project was very female slanted in terms of which characters got the spotlight. And one of the things that we wanted to do was help round that out more by giving more time to two of the characters, Darius and Liko, along the way. And, stuff like that, you always have to make a call, like, is it worth the time? And in a lot of cases, we said yes. Some cases, we actually ended up having to cut some things in the end. But it's just part of it is just when you're at the Kickstarter phase, you're still very much at a concept. Even if you have everything laid out, it's going to evolve so much when you're actually trying to execute everything. Usually for the better, but not always. I mean, sometimes you just realize something's too ambitious or it doesn't come together.
And I know for a lot of Kickstarters, devs that have had successful Kickstarters, but then like their game failed or they released and it didn't implement a lot of features. I know a lot of devs there kind of have explained that Kickstarter can cause a lot of scope creep if you're not absolutely careful with it. So it's very understandable that would have caused some of the changes within the Pirates Fate as well. So moving on from there, why did you guys go with like the pirate theme, or why was that one of your options when you were voting on it? Because I know some developers pick certain themes for reasons of either marketability or because they feel it'd be more familiar with the player. Did you just think it'd be a more interesting world to base your story in, or was there kind of a marketing reason behind that? If you kind of get what I'm talking about.
Well, I thought it would be interesting, and it actually wasn't the first time this idea came out. Before that, in order to sort of engage people, when we were doing the Patreon stories, we did a thing where we would post between 3 and 8 ideas, and we would ask the audience to vote on the ideas. And at one cycle, maybe 6 months before the Pirates Fate, we asked people to pick between a list of different, essentially like worlds for a large multi-character story to exist in. And I believe that, I'm not 100% certain about this one, but I believe that was the cycle where the Candy Factory ended up being the one that was picked, but a different possibility was the pirate world. And I had the idea of the magical coins. You collect the treasure and then the coins cause the crew to transform. And so that had sort of existed in my mind as this like cool idea we never really got to do. And so I think that was the reason why we were thinking about it.
Okay. So, the final question I have about the concept for the most part is, when you guys were first coming together with the idea and you were trying to get an idea of what it was looking at, outside of the fact that you saw you had a pretty decent chunk of support behind it and it looked like you would definitely get enough people to be able to kickstart it, was there any other evaluation you did on the idea to see if it was commercially viable, or did you just go off of what you were kind of seeing in your community?
Well, part of it was when we had originally started this, as it was just going to be a small thing, we weren't as concerned about that. When the scope started to grow, we did spend time, looking at similar games seeing if people like them, seeing, what about that genre could be improved, making some evaluations in terms of how long can we go working on this, or the cost of labor is just totally outweighed by totally outweighs whatever we could make off of it.
Of course, all of these assumptions were wrong. I'm laughing a little bit because we were so wrong about how long it would take. We were wrong about how much money we would raise in the Kickstarter. We were wrong about so many things. So honestly, here's the truth. The truth is, if you're thinking about making a game, unfortunately, 90% of indie games are not financial successes. So you kind of have to take a leap of faith. And that's absolutely what we did. We had no guarantee of success. Most of the research that we did produced assumptions which were not accurate. The game was, we were able to produce a game that we're very proud of and everything. But the truth is that if you want to be a developer, you kind of have to close your hands. You have to close your eyes and jump and hope you can fly. And that is what we did to an extent with the Pirates game.
So, on that, unfortunately, I do not remember his name, but he's a very prominent indie publisher. He has gone on record before. He's got several indie games that he's published under his belt successfully. That, if I remember what his quote was, is, "I cannot invest in hope, but I can invest in probablys." So what he kind of means by that is, he didn't want to hear someone come in and say, "Well, we're hoping this proves to be viable." He wanted to see that there were numbers and there was kind of a plan behind it, and there was a gray area, but that at least they know there's a gray area there and there looks to be a plan. Do you think that's kind of how you guys went with that, with your leap of faith? You kind of had a idea of what that gray area was, or was this more of a, well, it looks like it, let's hope and see what happens?
Well, that is what we tried to do, but as I just said, I think the assumptions that we made were wrong, and I actually think, hearing that quote makes me think I disagree with that perspective. I don't think that you can. I don't think if you've never made a game before, you can just do research and come to sound conclusions about probablys. I do think that you kind of have to make a leap into the unknown, and if you think you can, gauge things by looking at other games and saying, well, that game was successful, I'll make a similar game. You're just deluding yourself. And that goes for whether you are an independent person or a big company. We've seen that with other big companies. World of Warcraft is a really successful game. So suddenly every publisher says, oh, I'll make a game similar to World of Warcraft and I'll also make $1 billion. And it doesn't happen. Then they've done MOBAs. They're like, oh, the first couple of MOBAs were really successful. So every company wanted to make a MOBA and none of those were successful. You've seen several Hearthstone ripoffs crash and burn. So I feel like when people do research and says well, this is what it takes to be successful, so I'll just do that, you're almost always going to be wrong about your research. If you really want to be successful, you have to do something that's never been done. And by definition, you're not going to be able to have a test case scenario. You have to be the innovator. You know what I mean? And so I feel like you actually do kind of have to invest in hope. If you invest in data, but it's bad, you're kind of you're leading yourself in a direction where you have a sense of false certainty, or at least even a false probably,
Well, it's also one of those things too, where unfortunately there's a certain lack of information when it comes to game sales anyway, especially for small scale. It's one of those things too, where because it can vary so much, there's so many indie games out there now that don't succeed, that are kind of disrupting what you can expect out of it. Because, it seems like a lot of games just don't make any money at all. It does make getting that research hard. So in a lot of ways, you're almost, I'm not saying just charge off, assuming your idea is good, make an idea, maybe do some research into, is your idea interesting? Not in terms of how popular it will be to start, but just go, whenever you share this idea, do people express a genuine non-passing interest in wanting to play or engage with that idea, and start building off of that. You absolutely are going to have to do marketing, but one of the things I think that, at least that we found, was, a lot of the marketing comes from getting the people, the customer, the consumer, the gamer, to just be, one, see the game, get it so that it's somewhere that people can see, be it Steam, etc., and then get it so that when people see it, they're interested in buying. I know that sounds very vague, but it is one of those things.
A good product sells itself, right?
Yeah, as long as you can get people to see it. So it's one of those things where I would say focus less on, I know that let's pick a trope that was here 10 years ago, or I think it's more like 15 years ago now. Platformers. We know that we see all these platformers do well. I'll make a platform. In of itself, that might not be enough. And nowadays, you see an oversaturation of platformers. So you see the opposite. People saying, don't make a platformer, might not do well. But then a game like Celeste comes out and just totally blows the expectations out of the water. And does that mean that suddenly making a platformer is the right way to go? Not necessarily. It might just mean that idea was good, or the way that it was executed was good. Just look at things that did well, that are similar to your product, see why they did it, make some hunches. But ultimately, it's really based on the quality of your own idea and how your target demographic is responding to it.
Very interesting. Okay, so before we go on, just for context for the audience, the quote was taken from a GDC talk done by the man who is the CEO of the publisher of the game Descenders, and he was actually referencing evaluating the possibility of having a market there for your game. So if any of you are actually interested in hearing his full talk, you will see a link either in the video or somewhere in the description. So I'll link directly to that GDC if you wish to view that over and kind of compare the ideas that were given here by Vulcan and TF to his ideas on kind of how you evaluate that sort of stuff. Now, moving on from there, was there any target audience that you guys were specifically going for with the Pirate's Fate? Or were you just trying to aim for a general broad audience with it? Were you trying to go for you guys from Patreon, or were you just looking to kind of make a fun game, if you get what I'm kind of saying?
Initially, it was our core supporters from Patreon, but then after that, I kind of made the judgment call that furries were going to be the largest audience, because I knew that there were a lot of furries and there were not that many furry games, and very, very few visual novels that were good that were furry. So I figured, okay, that's going to be our core audience. And obviously, not everyone that likes the game identifies as a furry. Some people may dislike furries, but they like the game anyway. But it does seem like, from having talked to a lot of people who have played the game, that was our largest audience. So we were right about that.
And essentially what we wanted to do was, and this was important to us, was we tell a story that we want to tell, and we don't try to shy away from the kind of content that we make, per se. And so we tried to keep it general, but we didn't, for example, we had discussions early on about, if we go for Steam, do we cut out, for example, weight gain, or if you've played the game, the idle scene for particularly Tam's Path, one of the characters has a fertility type.
Yeah, I remember
we were asking
during I remember during the beta that there was some contention with you guys during that, because there was a concern, if I remember correctly, that it might be too overly sexualized. Is that correct?
We actually toned the scene down.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, that's the thing. We actually changed the art assets to tone it down slightly.
Yep. And so we try to keep that in mind, but again, at the end of the day, we said, this is the thing that we do excel at, or at least I think we do, that one of our strengths is conveying these types of characters and transformations. And what we try to do, instead of just cutting stuff out, we try to work hard to justify, to make it believable.
I'm so glad we did that, because if as far as I'm concerned, that is the best scene in Act 2. It by far has the best writing, in my opinion, and it also has the best illustrated transformation sequence. in the whole game, actually, in my opinion. The idle tam tam transformation. So I'm really glad we left it in because I think it's one of the best scenes in the game.
Yep. So essentially, like so it's kind of just a mix of both. We did what we thought was authentic to ourselves, and we tried to accommodate a wide variety of people that we felt were not being catered to. I mean, like, so there's definitely a rise in furry games lately in terms of there's anthropomorphic species, but often it's either, it's just a secondary presence, like, oh, there's a furry character in this RPG, or it's just like a general
kind of an aesthetic choice.
Right. And now obviously, because there's no human anthro element in Pirate's Fate, all the characters being furry is kind of a given. So there's not a ton of time spent on that. But, this is a game that celebrates, the diversity of, furry characters and, the type of stories that can offer. For one thing, a lot of the characters in the game are actually cameos from the community that we tried to integrate as, organically. But, really, it's just, you gotta follow the creative vision as you see it, and then just tailor it as you see fit relative to the context and circumstance.
Very interesting. Okay, so that finishes up the concept talk. So I want to get into the pre-production, which some people believe is probably one of the most important phases of actually building a game, or even just like a general piece of software. And this is going to be a fairly open-ended question, but I would like to kind of get a brief overview of how you guys did your pre-production process. Did writing take priority? Did art take priority? Did you do art concepts and kind of put them back and forth between each other? How did you kind of come up with the more concrete design of this game?
The pre-production was, we made a demo. And this is getting into, I think, a question you're going to ask later, but we made a demo in a different engine just as sort of a proof of concept type thing. So Volk did the pictures. He ended up redoing all the pictures because he wanted to make them better. And I did a scene which ended up being very similar to the first scene of the game in the finished product. And it was about 7 minutes long. And I ended up taking my laptop to Califer and actually demoing this scene out for people and trying to sign people up for cameos and stuff. And people really liked it. And aside from that, we actually didn't do much pre-production. We ended up kind of winging it after the Kickstarter, and that ended up being kind of a mistake because a lot of the work that we did kind of had to be redid. So not very good pre-production planning / outlining was one of the mistakes I would say that we made.
And one of the things is also that we ran into was there's kind of a balance, in my opinion, between preparation and execution. And one of the things that we've seen, peers of ours or just in general, is it's extremely easy to get over intimidated the more you start thinking this out ahead of time. So on the flip side, if you don't think anything of it out, you're going to run and head into first into problems, which we actually ran into quite a few, as Steve mentioned. But it was important to us to make sure that we kept the enthusiasm up and made sure that we were actually felt confident that we could put, pen to paper and actually get writing, get art, get all of that out, make sure that we can execute it. So the demo, because it was a proof of concept, our main concern was not pre-production in like a broad outline sense, but pre-production to prove to ourselves that we could do it and that people would be interested in what we could do. And one of the promises that we had made was, we need to make sure that anything we do in this proof of concept demo, we can guarantee that we can execute to a final game and then just improve it from there. And from that baseline, we went forward. So we tried to also be a little, whether you think that we succeed or not, we tried to be, kind of smaller scale about the idea and then grow from there, as opposed to going too ambitious and then shrinking it back where we could. There are a couple places where that didn't quite happen, but that was the overall goal.
Yeah, and that's very understandable. It's like design methodologies in software like Agile tries to tackle that issue, because if you do too much planning up front, it makes you rigid and it can cause a bit of a fear factor. But you do too much, you do too little up front, it can cause you to feel lost. So trying to maintain that flexibility while also trying to have enough direction to go forward always tends to be a little bit of an issue, even in professional software development. So moving forward from there, let's talk more about the Kickstarter that you guys actually did. So what made you guys actually choose to kickstart the project? Was it just the reaction you saw there and the feedback you were getting where you were like, you should sell this game? Or did you really, like, what kept you from just kind of keeping it closed off and then releasing it with your own funds kind of in the end? What kind of pushed you towards that way, if you get what I mean?
We had several people recommend that we do it on Kickstarter, which was a really good idea because it raised a lot more support and a lot more awareness than Patreon did. And it's possible we could have just done like a monthly Patreon thing for the entire development cycle, but I think that would have raised a lot more red flags, and we said it was going to take so much longer. So I'm glad we decided to do Kickstarter. It seems like it's the best tool for people to want to do indie projects.
For something like this, at least, obviously it depends on what you're doing. Some games that have a more routine update schedule or more modular, I've seen them do Patreons all right. But yeah, I mean, the Kickstarter worked really well for us because it was, we were trying to do a contained type of idea and then just build it from there. But yeah, that's the other element is we actually had people fund the game. They didn't know about our other work. They didn't really know about our stories or, my gallery or TF's website or anything like that. And that's one of the big moments where we learned that Kickstarter actually helped, market our presence. Patreon Patreon has a lot of benefits, but one of the things that it's not as focused on is you don't really go to Patreon and just browse people's projects. You are directed to go to a specific Patreon to support a specific person from the get-go.
Yeah, and I know like the browsing part of Patreon is also hampered by, if I could be wrong on this, but if I remember, I believe any Patreon that's marked as not safe for work is kind of removed from their browsing. So that means you either need to search for them directly or you need a direct link for their site.
Mm.
But
I don't know if we're not safe for work or not. I don't think we should be. We don't have anything not safe for work on.
I'm not totally sure on your guys's if you actually mark that or not, but I know there's a fair few that have that stuff marked, and they complain about discoverability issues just due to that fact. But yeah, and you guys make a good point with Kickstarter as an advertising tool. I think if I remember correctly, the people that do Cards Against Humanity have went on record saying that because they were asked in an interview once, why do you always do a Kickstarter? You've got more than enough money to do these projects. And they outright stated it's a great advertising tool. That even if they don't make their minimum amount they're asking for, it gets more people looking at the project and can kind of build hype a little bit for it ahead of time. So, moving on from there, when you put your stretch goals up, how did you kind of figure your price points? Did you kind of choose them arbitrarily, or was there a little bit of calculation that went on there saying, well, it's going to take us, I believe, this much extra work, so we will need this much extra money? And obviously, this is a very broad question because as TFRA went over, the estimations were wildly off, but I'm just trying to get an idea of your process when you were figuring those.
You took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was going to say. We trusted in the data, and the data was wrong. So you don't do that. Don't do the probablys. Don't add it up in your head and say, well, it'll take this amount of work. That's how much it will cost. Because you're always going to estimate it too low. I would say if you're out there and you want to make a game, don't put any stretch goals on your project that are going to substantially burden yourself beyond what you're already comfortable doing for free, honestly, because you have no idea how difficult it will be to do something unless you've already done it. we definitely over obligated ourselves. Even the things that were relatively simple to do ended up actually being quite difficult. So, for example, one of the stretch goals was to make a comic, and we were like, how much work will it take to make a comic? And of course, we had the talent to make one, but it ended up taking a lot longer and a lot more blood, sweat, and tears than we had expected, just because we wanted to make a really, really good comic that would be at this professional level of being worthy of being on Steam and everything. So ultimately, yeah, it's one of those things where we did not add it up right. But ultimately, despite that, I'm glad that we did it. We had a comic that ended up being cool. We had some really exciting voice actors. We had fun working with them, etc. So, yeah.
I will say this: if you want something concrete, or at least a little more concrete, because Jeff's right, across the board on that one. If you want something to think about, and this is one thing that gets tricky to evaluate, is if you have a stretch goal and you have tiers that give specific rewards, you have to recognize that. So say you're going from $5,000 to $10,000. To get that $5,000, you are going to get other obligations by getting people donating at particular tiers, but you're giving them a t-shirt or a physical copy of your game or whatever. And so if you evaluate your, $5,000 more stretch goal as being, $5,000 worth of labor, you're already in the red because you've already obligated yourself to other labor just to get the number high enough. And that gets to be a tricky balancing. Obviously, you can say, well, I hope to make it up with the main game. But when you start to get to bigger numbers and now you're, $15,000 in the red because you say obligated yourself to doing animations by offering, custom, cameo scenes, for example, in your game, the math will start to hurt you. So the only thing I would say is be very aware of what you are obligating yourself to on both levels, because it adds up across.
Okay. So, kind of my last question on the Kickstarter is, I don't believe this is much of a problem from smaller projects, but it still has to deal with kind of the cost estimation. I know what kills a lot of people tends to be taxes. Very successful Kickstarters have stated that they have lost between 20 to 40% of their Kickstarter money just in processing fees and taxes alone. Did that prove to be a factor with your guys' Kickstarter at all? Did you account for that at all? Or did it just prove to be so insignificant with the amount that you ended up raising that it really wasn't anything that was to worry you guys?
Well,
yeah, I mean,
we're a bad example on that front, because you got to remember, we went effectively a year over our estimate, so we did most of the game development out of pocket. So,
yeah, I mean, here's the truth. If you want to know, the amount of money that you spend on taxes is not really that relevant. So, the average Kickstarter will only take in about 90% of the money that you see that they got, because Kickstarter has a 5% fee, and then the credit card and PayPal processing fees are about 3%. And then you also have just like some people entering credit cards that are maxed out by the time, Kickstarter tries to collect them, or they have some other issue, chargeback fraud stuff. So it just take 10% off. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that like the real cost to Kickstarter isn't the fees or the taxes. The real cost is just the time. It takes a lot of time to set up the Kickstarter, to manage it, to build the word, to do promo pictures as Folk did, promo streams, write blog posts everywhere, register for accounts on places that you never heard of just to spread the word, and then have people tell you like, hey, you're supposed to be talking about other things, not spamming or whatever. It's like there's like the constant work takes time, and the expense of employing yourself and doing all this unpaid labor is the real expense, not the fees.
And the reality is, obviously, you want to make more than the cost of labor on that, but of just setting up Kickstarter. But it's not always as easy to simply say this. It's harder to do in execution. But the ideally the Kickstarter should be to help supplement this process. If you are totally and utterly dependent on every penny from the Kickstarter, you're going to be in a tough place anyway, because you never know what's going to happen. Obviously, as you have mentioned, people's credit cards max out. Some people ask for a refund later. You might get hit, like you had mentioned, with taxes. You could get hit with all sorts of things. So the Kickstarter should be the means of taking something from being maybe like most of the way viable and just kind of tipping it over. That is probably the better place to be overall. Now, it's never as simple as that. You might not be able to do that, but because the overwhelming labor of making these games is just, and the overwhelming cost is just putting the time in, the Kickstarter can only help you so much with that anyway. So it's not going to be some magic solution for you, even if the Kickstarter does go well.
And that's a very good point, because I believe that's what a good majority of people tend to think. Because in those instances with the 20 to 40%, they made, like, let's say $300,000, $400,000, and they allocated all that to development, and then they got hit with fees and taxes and ended up with less than they originally budgeted for, and that caused them to go under. So, that is definitely a very valid point and a good thing to think on if you're considering to try Kickstarter for your game. So moving on from Kickstarter, let's talk a little bit about the technology. Now, I know the first technology you guys looked at, specifically engine-wise, was Trano Builder. So what made that appealing to you guys over some of the other ones out on the market? Like the one that I always say off the top of my head is RenPy.
Trano Builder is easier, and we didn't know how to program, so the idea of something that allowed you to do drag and drop without writing code appealed to us.
And keep in mind, too, where we were initially. When we say that we didn't know how to code, for those of you that have never used these engines, so as TF expressed, Trano Builder is just dragging and dropping objects and icons and the like. RenPy, while it is simple, it is a giant text box, and you have to type in all the commands. And while it's not hard, coding, you need to be familiar enough with, putting in the text and so forth. And we were so unfamiliar with that between the two, and not knowing the limitations of both at the higher end use, for a professional product of a large scale. Trano Builder just seemed like the better option.
Okay, so I know the end product of the Pirate's Fate ended up using, I believe, his visual novel engine. Am I correct on that one?
Yes.
So what ended up causing you guys to switch from Trano Builder to visual novel engine?
Trano Builder had a number of issues, limitations, including the fact that we couldn't get the interface to change in the middle of the game, and that there were other people who were trying to use it to make commercial products and having problems with it at large sizes. A Visual Novel Maker was a new program, and we were admitted into their sort of pilot program to test it before it was officially released. They also promised to do marketing on our behalf. So because it was a new program from a company, the same company that makes RPG Maker, because they promised to do marketing for us, marketing was always kind of a struggling point. And because it was also, like Trano Builder, supposed to be a drag and drop engine that didn't require you to know coding in order to use it. For all those reasons, I thought it was going to be a good engine.
Okay. So now, you guys kind of answered these questions, but I'm going to try to poke and prod to see if I can get a few more details out from you. So, when you were beginning the pre-production of this, did you do any outlining of the plot? Like, did you figure out the paths beforehand, kind of the general way you wanted to go about it, or were you just kind of constructing this in a bit of an ad hoc manner as you went along?
Just from one series of conversation threads, Volk and I made 37 separate outlines. Again, that was over a period of about 6 weeks. If you look at the total number of outlines that we made, the entire project, it was probably over 100. So yeah, we did tons of outlining.
But that was once, I don't know what your definition necessarily is of pre-production. That was when we were actually sitting down. We had been funded, and now we're going to begin. If you're talking about before even starting Kickstarter and all that, it was much more conceptual.
Pre-production is kind of a bit of a gray area. I count pre-production personally as when you're kind of working out the more solid details of the game and really haven't like started major construction on it yet. So for me, maybe designing some of the systems ahead of time, figuring out your plot in at least a general enough sense that you can fill in the specifics later, etc., etc.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, we did dozens and dozens of outlines. A lot of it also was we would, so we made this our full-time job after so TF started with it being his full-time job. I was working in a law firm for a few months, and then I left to make this my full-time job too. Once that transition happened, we would spend hours, usually daily, on the phone talking ideas, and that goes a long way. So on top of all the formal outlining, we talked relentlessly, and we would bounce ideas off each other. We would critique and build off of each other. It just and that shaped things down the road. And so when we started, we did really broad. Then we were thinking about how do we actually get through Act 1, and then we set up Act 2. That one was fairly simple. Act 3, we had to spend a whole other series of weeks. It was really weeks of just trying to plan out, closing all the, the plot elements, managing choice, fitting in all the content that was on our kind of our list of goals, etc. And the other element too that we had to do was so for example on the art side, I outright made a spreadsheet of all the assets that were known, both for cutscenes and just in-game character assets, and listing those out as far in advance as I could, so that I could start budgeting time and keep track of just how much am I getting done a day? Am I on target? Is this good? Are we getting there fast enough? I know TF had to do a lot of tracking of his own, make sure everything was playing together as well.
Very interesting. And that kind of leads me into my second question, and this is more directed at you, Vulcan. When you were kind of dealing with these characters, let's say when you were designing Mila, for instance, were you kind of drawing just a bunch of rough concepts and then passing it back and forth between each other and doing small alterations to that? Or did you kind of just go with one standard type and then just let it evolve as the project went forward?
Oh, it varied from character to character. Some characters, there was, I'll give you an easy one. Liko. Liko's default form underwent no editing that I can recall. It was just, we did it. We both looked at it, liked it, moved on. Other characters like Morgana took days of editing and figure out what we wanted to do with her. In which case it was at first tweaking a design and then eventually abandoning the design and doing a whole different direction, seeing that would work. And we had to do that for multiple characters. But, some characters are fine, some weren't. Mila's default design was one of the ones that did not really require any editing. Darius, same thing, minus changing the proportions a bit from the proof of concept demo to the full body character asset. We made him taller and not quite as heavy set. But it just varies from design. The other thing too, it just depends also on what it is that you want to do with the character. So there were some characters that were super minor that, frankly, it didn't really matter what they looked like as long as they came off at a polished quality. And then there were other ones where, for example, TF would have a very specific writing style that he wanted to do for a character. And the question became, was the art asset fitting enough of that writing? And sometimes it was the flip side. So like I said, Liko will be an example of, we had a character design before we had fully fleshed out the character writing. So it went both ways, but some were easy, some were hard.
Very interesting. Okay. So, last question of the pre-production section. I want to ask you guys a little bit about, did you have kind of a rough release plan in place? Did you, once again, I understand everything's been off, but I'm saying, like, did you guys think, okay, so at this point we're going to want to go into alpha, or we feel we have enough to go into alpha? At this point we have a beta, and at this point we have the release.
Yeah, I mean, basically.
Yeah.
We did those specific stages, and we tried to do bug testing and everything. There were a lot of technical issues that we had to solve.
So
yeah.
when you chose to like bring it into the alpha state, did you have a set of features, or at least a amount completed in mind, where you said, okay, this is now complete enough to become an alpha? Mm-hmm. Or was it more played by ear, where it was like, okay, this feels about right, so let's now just put out this as an alpha and start getting some stuff back?
I guess more play it by ear, because there were so many technical problems that, like, at any given moment, we weren't even sure how many of them were fixable. There's this question of, like, how broken should we allow it to be? How many features should we just eliminate if we can't fix them, etc.? Because there was a lot of difficult moments at the end there.
Yeah. So, and it obviously beta was more refined. When it came to alpha, longest time, we didn't really have other people testing this. It was very much, the huge bulk of the work was before the actual coding. Now, the coding became a very significant portion, in part because of the difficulties that we had, managing some issues with, the engine and the like. But the putting those aside, once we were starting to actually plug in the asset, plug in the story, plug in the choices, we were kind of testing it from scene to scene. Beta was a much harder question than alpha. Beta was very much, do we want people to see it? If it's too buggy, are people going to be forgiving? Will it be bad PR if the word gets out? If it's too buggy, how forgiving are people with that? But like, at the end of the day, it goes back to one of those things where, if you spend too much time fiddling with those types of specifications, it's going to start to paralyze you a bit, because you can plan this out extensively and it's just not going to go the way that you think it is. And it's far more imperative that you are able to remain adaptable and, more importantly, remain motivated enough to continue to do the work. I'm assuming this is different for more experienced developers, larger teams, etc. Totally different context. This was for huge swaths.
Actually, what you're describing is actually so common that it is known as a project management anti-pattern called analysis paralysis, where you become so focused on issues like that, it effectively stalls development. So it is actually more common issue than you may actually think.
Well, there you go. I guess that the word of caution hopefully rings true. But at the end of the day, I can't stress it enough. I have seen many people that have come to me. They have fantastic ideas, and the thing that it's not money that's holding them back. In a lot of cases, it's not even skill that's holding them back. It's the time availability and the ability to just dump in thousands upon thousands of hours of labor. And it's easy to talk about, if you're making a cool world, talking about the factions, talking about the system, talking about the characters and concept, but there will be a point, no matter how enthusiastic you are about your idea, that you are not going to be jazzed about actually executing it. And it's so important to not give yourself excuses to not do the work that might be unpleasant. And unfortunately, sometimes those planning or standards can really impede your ability to actually push past that. Because one of the things you have to recognize is when it gets really hard, you're going to, whether you're aware of it or not, you're going to start to look for excuses to not have to go through this, be it legitimate ones or not, but you got to be able to combat that. So I'd say in some respects, just remain flexible.
Very interesting. Okay. Some good advice on that front. So let's now move on to development. The first one I feel is probably going to be something you'll all enjoy. I want to ask you about the roles you guys had to play. So let's start with TF first. What kind of hats did you have to wear while you were actually developing the Pirate's Fate?
I was a writer, an editor, a coder, a beta tester, a bug tester, and a marketer. I'll skip ahead a little bit and ask the next question: which hats did I like the most, and which hats did I like the least? Obviously, I like the writing, although it became difficult because it was a new type of writing. I'm used to writing books, not writing screenplays. And I also like components of the beta. I like doing the read aloud. I like the Twitch streams. I like sort of seeing people's reaction when I give them a sort of semi-finished product or finished product. So that was the best. By far, the worst was the technical stuff. It wasn't just because I'm not a coder, and so I had to learn a new skill, but a lot of the technical problems that we had to solve were macro level stuff, like the save load thing not working right when we were first doing it, and we had spent so many hours trying to fix that. There were other issues too relating to the game, like suddenly crashing during moments. One moment that was like both the best and the worst part of development was there was a glitch that was causing the game to crash, and I talked to a lot of different people about it, including talking to a person that helped develop the engine, and no one was able to help figure this out. And so I sat there thinking, how can I fix this? How can I fix this? I ended up fixing it by creating a sort of duct tape system that disabled the game's ability to recognize you were pressing a certain button that was causing the game to crash during specific moments. And that was able to fix the problem. But like, that was a few days before we were going to launch. And I was totally freaking out thinking that we were going to launch the game that was going to keep crashing. And I imagined like people's streams and reviews crashing while people were trying to play them. And so I was proud of myself for pulling this trick out of the bag, but the stress that I went under, like worrying about these issues that shouldn't have ever really been issues in the first place, especially not from a creativity point of view, which is really, really terrible. And I'm really hoping that in the future, I don't have to do that again.
I can completely sympathize with you, especially since for those of you that don't know, VN Maker uses JavaScript as its underlying language, and that stuff is fairly notoriously hard to debug through, especially when it didn't seem like, at least when I was working with the engine with you guys, they seemed to have any sort of debugger in there at all. It was all console outputs to the Chrome console in order to figure out what was actually going on under the hood. So
yeah, you saw how much I was freaking out. I definitely don't want to be that person ever again.
Yeah. So now, same question to you, Vulcan. What hats did you wear? What was your favorite, and what was your most hated?
Well, obviously the main hat that I wore was doing the managing the art. So I did not do the background art, and I did not do the interface, but I did all the character art, all the cutscenes, all the romances, all the endings, all the promotional art, all the Kickstarter assets, all that stuff. Outside the logo. And then one of the things, it was funny because a lot of the non-art, non-writing stuff was effectively a toss-up. So one of the ideas was, the art's going to be something that's going to be produced throughout the whole dev cycle. So TF volunteered to do the programming. One of the things that I did was I volunteered to do a lot of the marketing. We both did marketing, obviously. So it was a lot of sending out the emails, contacting the people, posting the actual announcements, although TF obviously did the Kickstarter, updates and the like, if you've been following those. So there's a lot of stuff like that. We had to do editing and the like too. Not from I didn't actually touch the script, but one of the things that was important was, TF would evaluate and critique all the art that I did, and I would read the script and critique, what TF wrote, and we go through drafts like that. So So it was a lot of that. In terms of the things I liked and disliked the most, it depends on your definition of like and dislike. So I like character design. So I had a lot of fun in my wheelhouse of drawing these characters doing things. And like, it was a little hard to do the sequences and so forth because there's so many of them. But in terms of disliking, if we're going strictly by hard, one of the hardest things, ironically, was also the art, not just in quantity, but getting all the romances out there, for example. So there are almost 50 unique romance illustrations in the pirate space. And they each went through 1 to 3 versions. So there's actually like, I would say about 150 romance pictures just sitting out there. And it was just cut, recut, and a lot of it was, I had no idea how to draw it. It was a totally different type of experience. That part was hard, but I ended up liking it towards the end, and that I felt like I grew from it. In terms of just not liking things, part of the thing that I really didn't like was the emailing. It sounds trivial. When you are like 1,000 emails into sending out, hey, you want to go and review our game? Here's a key. And then you do that, and it's not just a chain email. You got to cater to the person that you're writing to, so that it's, they understand that you're paying attention to what they do. And you also have to write and spend all this time knowing that the overwhelming odds are they're never going to even open the email, let alone deny you when they do. And that you have to fight the urge to just ignore that feels useless, because it only takes, one person with a network influence to make a difference. But, yeah, I mean, I was okay overall with most of my things. I was spared the, I did a lot of the beta testing. So one of the things that, I had to go and discover was I was trying to break the game in any way I could think of. And that's not nearly as hard as fixing it. So I had the mild, unpleasant, especially compared to what Kiev had to go through. I had to be the guy that kept giving bad news. Like, hey, I just spent all night. I didn't sleep. I tried to fix this thing. Can you test it? I'd turn on. I'd replicate the issue again. And it was just like, oh gosh, that part was not fun to be the conveyor of bad news so often on that. But,
that's pretty much every quality assurance department ever. It's a very necessary job, but we've got devs that are just buried under bugs, and you see another email pop in your inbox of, oh, hey, I need something fixed. You just want to pound your head against the desk. Okay, so moving on from that, I'm pretty sure I know what you guys are all going to talk about on this question. But what unforeseen issues did you kind of end up hitting during development?
I would say 2 big ones, if you want to categorize them, right? Wouldn't it just be the coding and the story structuring?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of already talked about it. The game became a lot more complicated than we initially thought that it would be, and that made it take longer. And then also the technical issues were a lot harder to solve than they ought to have been, and that took a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears. And yeah, there you go.
Well, because like there's all these little things, and it's not even so. We had a very rough time with technical issues, and a lot of it was frustrating because it was out of our hands to fix, because they were either foundational to the engine, or it required the expertise of the people. We were so fortunate that, in the respect that the people who made the engine were actually talking with us and working with us, but that was really hard. But another element that was very rough to deal with in some ways was when you are writing and conceptualizing a game, you can, if you're not familiar with coding as we were in the beginning, there were all these things that particularly TF discovered that just increased the workload overwhelmingly. We could go into a huge rant about the difference between paths and splits, for example, but it's one of those things where just you're going to hit a point where you realize that coding is overwhelming the workload relative to your original idea, and that really hard thing to overcome if you don't know how to adapt or get the right kind of help.
So just for the benefit of our viewers, I'm going to try to just find out the splits real quick. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. But what they are referring to in that is that during the visual novel, there was a few areas where multiple decisions resulted in kind of a visual change, but it still kind of stayed along the same storyline. And then they ended up having assets kind of fighting each other, where they would have one asset end up switching with another on the next scene and something similar like that. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, there's a scene in one of the idle paths where you can either have Liko get the coin or Tam Tam get the coin, and that causes a transformation to happen to those characters. And what that means is that for the rest of the game, both Tam Tam and Liko are in a state of split, because I have to do a logic check for which Liko or which Tam Tam. And on some of these paths, you had lots of splits. So, for example, on one of the paths that we nicknamed NDB, you had 2 Likos, 3 Tam Tams, and 2 Dariuses, which meant that there was tons of permutations or height differences. Sometimes I had to account for the Z ordering of certain characters, because a character could disappear if he was behind the wrong one or something. So that ended up being really, really difficult, and created a lot of extra work.
Okay, so moving on from that, were there any issues that you guys expected to really hit you hard, but actually turned out to not be as bad as you originally expected them to be?
No. Next question.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any of them. I don't think so.
Okay, so I want to move on to contractors real quick then. I know from the beta that you guys did bring in a few other contractors. Obviously, you had voice actors, but what other contractors did you end up bringing on?
We hired multiple people to help us with the coding. We hired people to help us with certain things. We hired obviously we had someone working on the music. We had a couple of people do music, people doing the interface art, editing, all of that background art. Yeah, we had a lot of different types of things. And unfortunately, when you try to seek out contractors, there's always going to be an issue of people flaking out. But that's not necessarily because people are like in a specific industry are bad. It's just that that's just how it is. I talked to someone who works for a big game studio, and they said that when they hire people to show up at the studio to do voice acting, about 50% of them don't show up. And when I was working in politics, and I was hiring people to do fundraisers, I did interviews, and about half the people wouldn't show up when we, had them scheduled for an interview. And if I interviewed someone and hired them, about half of them would not show up for their first day of work. That's just the truth of people in general. It's not necessarily endemic to an industry. It's just a lot of people just flake out.
Very interesting. So, I want to ask you on managing your contractors then. So, I know, like, from my own personal experience where I work, we've had issues with managing contractors in the past, keeping them on schedule, making sure they were working on what they were supposed to be working. Did you guys have to do anything special to kind of deal with your contractors, or did the ones that didn't like flake out on you work pretty well with you guys? It didn't really require a lot of management.
It varied from person to person. Some, it in part depended on how involved the person was. So, for example, we paid someone to do our trailer, and they had said that they were less familiar with visual novels, but they were really experienced with other form of storytelling, conveying experiences. So we had to spend, more time talking about, well, not just the visual novel, but, what's the whole furry side of it, transformation side of it, etc., and kind of bringing them up to speed. Whereas someone like our background artist, Vidisco knew about the idea from the beginning of the project. And, we didn't have to explain kind of the core elements of that. but obviously we'd have to go over each individual background and what we're looking for, and so the workload just varies from person to person. Worky did the music, and he was involved throughout. So sometimes we would just give him free range to just create something based off of a mood. Sometimes we have a very specific context that we would need him to do, and it would require a lot more back and forth. So, it just varies. It's just important to, when you are hiring someone, that they are available in the way that you need. So if you're the type of person that, for example, wants to micromanage because you feel that you can resolve issues ahead of time by being on top of someone the moment that a problem occurs, so that nothing becomes too serious. That's a different type of worker than someone that you want to go, I don't even want to have to think about the music. I just want to throw money at you and then come back 6 months later and it's all done. Totally different type of work. So it's just identify what you need and then try to, you might not find it, so you might have to adapt yourself, but start from there and see what type of workers pop up that fit your desired
perfect
workflow.
So this is a good segue into kind of learning a little bit more about your workflow. Specifically, how did you find your contractors, and did you do like any vetting of them, or did you go after some that you knew the personal work ahead of time? I know, for instance, some people would put out calls to voice actors for voice samples or musicians for samples before they make a decision on who to contract. Did you do anything similar like that?
We did put out a couple public calls, and some people stepped up. Some people, would help us out with that. But a lot of it, overwhelming majority of it, was us finding people and then going to them. You're in a bad position as a developer, in my opinion, which take with a grain of salt because we've only made this one game so far. But you're in a bad position if you are putting a request out there and hoping someone will respond. You are likely just going to have to find them yourself, offer something to them, vet them, whatever you need to do, but you're not going to have the market presence or the market authority to have people just drop in your lap that are going to be any good. You might luck out, maybe. I mean, it absolutely could happen, but we spent a lot of times, like, for example, with voice actors, a lot of our work was sitting down, going through a bunch of forums where voice actors would post, going through YouTube and looking through demo reels and SoundCloud and all that stuff, making a list of people that you like and just start chipping through it and see if they even respond to you. And if they do, what are their prices and when are they available? I mean, that's sometimes all you can hope for.
And that makes perfect sense, because even when it comes to selling a product and finding people, it's really kind of a numbers game in the end. So the more you can kind of put out there, the higher the chance you might actually get someone. So that makes perfect sense. I think the last thing I'm going to ask you guys on the development cycle here, since we're running a bit long here, is I want to ask, what was the hardest development issue that you had to solve in the Pirate's Fate?
I think I already answered that question about there was an issue where the game was crashing and we didn't know how to fix it. I think I described that process.
Okay, so you would say that was the hardest issue out of all of them that you actually had to solve, was that crashing issue, and was that just because it was so close to launch?
Yeah.
It
was also during a convention, and I was having like 6 hours of sleep over about 3 days because of this issue, and also doing work for the convention.
Yep. And then everything else was, not everything, a lot of the big picture stuff that got hard was very much in the earlier phases, like, covering act 3 and, how to resolve a bunch of things and how do you do that and working everything out and try to catch as many problems in advance as you can. It's a very different type of hard.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to the release section. So I understand, and I want the audience to know that some of the questions on here, I'm going to be asking them. I know they probably won't be able to actually answer. They are under NDAs with certain distributors and such. But I want to ask to just see if we can get some of that information, because some of it is kind of lax. If there is any questions I do ask you guys that you can't answer, feel free to just pass. We understand that you might be under an NDA or it's just something you don't wish to disclose. So starting with the first one is, could you give us any insight with how you were negotiating with Steam and some of the other sales platforms you tried to get on? I know originally the Pirate's Fate was greenlit.
Yeah, our Steam experience is probably not going to be applicable because we went through Steam Greenlight, and that's no longer a thing.
Yeah, if you want to do Steam, you can look up how to submit the application. I believe the fee is $100.
Yeah, it's about $100, $200 fee now.
Yeah, okay. So you submit that, and then you go through the process. There's like a long FAQ that Valve has explaining how to do it. It's not that difficult.
What about a Humble Bundle? Because I believe that was the other platform you were able to get on. Did you have to do any negotiating there, or did you kind of just message them and they were like, oh yeah, sure, we'll add you on there?
It was pretty easy, but we're in the Humble store. We haven't actually been in the Humble Bundle.
Okay. So, moving on from that, let's talk about the price point. So how did you guys come up with a price point of $19.99 for the Pirate's Fate?
Honestly, I saw that Major Minor was $19.99, and I thought we have a game that's at least as good as that, so that's what I want to do.
So just a simple comparison?
Yep.
Okay.
And it's one of those things, you spend too much time on it, it's going to chew you alive. It's like, we could have done, well, our illustrated stories are $5. How many more times of content are we going to get relative to an illustrated story? Go by that metric and we're being stupid. But, or alternatively, are you charging by the number of hours? Are you charging the word count? Are you charging by one playthrough or multiple playthroughs? Be careful. That's all I can really say. It gets too complicated too fast.
Yep, and I understand that. The reason why I bring it up is because underpricing can tend to be a bit of a chronic issue within the indie community. Because a good example is that Descenders game that I mentioned earlier in the interview. I believe they're going maybe for $35 or something like that. Originally, they only wanted to do like $9, and they sold extremely well at that higher price point. So I just wanted to get some insight on how you guys actually came up with that price point. The next one is going to be more kind of dealing with another kind of project management anti-pattern called the fear of success. And for our viewers that don't know about this, it's actually a psychological thing, but it does pop up in project management a lot too. And what it deals with is, for both a combination of technical and psychological issues, a team does not wish to terminate the project. They don't want to release it. And it's not necessarily per se a fear of success, but it's just a fear of putting the project out there. And I know that can kill a lot of indie games, because some enter just dev hell because they enter that perpetual fear and they never pick a moment where they're like, okay, we have to push this out. And then they just kind of end up collapsing in on themselves. So how did you guys deal with that?
Never even crossed my mind. The entire time I was thinking, what if we never finish? I was very, very happy when we were ready to release. I was potentially concerned that some people wouldn't like it, but when we were in the technical phases, I was like, oh my God, I wanted to release months ago. Why can't we get this done? So there was never a point where I was afraid to release. I was always just afraid that there'd be some obstacle that would prevent us from releasing.
Well, sorry. Continue first.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, essentially it all broke down into, did we catch enough stuff to release it? That really, because you got to remember, we had planned to release months earlier. The only thing really stopping us was technical complications. So, and, even during all that, we did add more plot and artwork to the game just to help, keep it, counteract bugs, but we were ready to go much earlier. So we were pretty assured and the level of content that we had at the time, that wasn't terribly on our mind in the same way.
Well, were there any bugs that you guys were that were in the game around release where you thought that it would be okay to release with those and fix them later because they were so minor? Or were you focusing on almost kind of just getting rid of as many as you could, regardless of their severity to the game overall?
I mean, the game actually, like, we knew that there were going to be some issues. Frankly, there are issues with AAA titles that persist not just past launch date, but for years. So we knew that the game was going to have some issues that we would never be able to fix, or there were going to be some issues that we fixed a couple of days after launch. I feel, again, considering it was a first game attempt and we had never done this before, I do feel pretty happy with the amount of stuff that we did fix by the time that we launched it. But we knew it wasn't going to be perfect.
Okay. So now I want to ask you a little bit on your advertising of the game. How did you go about that? Do you feel that maybe you should have started advertising the release sooner? Do you think you kind of got it at about the right time? Because I'm not sure when you actually started advertising, but if I remember from the beta, it was relatively close to your release date.
I'm not sure if the advertising that we did was effective. Before we launched the game, we knew that marketing was going to be one of our weak points. I'm not sure that what we did was as effective as we necessarily wanted it to be, but we went to, we tried to drum up support on a semi-continuous basis, and then we really ramped it up about a month or two before release. We went to lots of different places. We got people on YouTube to play it. We got people to write articles about it. We got the international press to cover it. People from Spain wrote about us. We got different Twitch streamers to try it. We got very popular people on Furfinity and DeviantArt to create fan art for us. We got people to retweet us who were connected with all kinds of things. So we did a lot of things. I'm not sure if it made a difference, but I definitely know we tried our best to reach as many audiences as we could.
If you guys end up doing another game or some additional content, is there any way you would try to advertise the game differently than you did with this first attempt that you guys attempted?
Frankly, in the same way that I'm not really qualified to be a programmer, I kind of had to learn it myself. I knew that because of similar like marketing related issues in the past for books and stuff, I'm not necessarily an expert on marketing. So I hope that in the future I can connect with someone who is an expert on marketing and ask them for advice, because I tried all the ideas that were in my head, and I'm not sure how successful they were, but because it doesn't, there's no way to know when you make a sale where it came from. It doesn't work that way. So because of that, I don't know, but I do hope that I can talk to actual experts or people who have built up some kind of infrastructure that we can maybe pay them to use or something, because I don't know if it's within my power to come up with something radically different than what I already did.
Okay. So moving on from that, let's talk about your post-release content and support for the game. I remember that you guys actually released a relatively decent-sized content game content update post-release.
Yeah, we did 3 epilogues. People said that the endings weren't satisfying enough, so we were like, okay, we're going to make a more elongated ending. So we did 3 additional epilogues that provided a extended adventure after the credits, after the main campaign was finished, and they were generally very well received by the community. People were really happy for them. So yeah, I was very proud of them.
Well, that and a lot of our post content. I mean, like, we knew that we wanted to very closely try to keep in touch with people playing our game. So, if you're not, while that might not have translated specifically into, we did the 3 epilogues, for example, but we talked with people, we asked them their thoughts. Obviously, if they caught any bugs or typos, etc., we would try to add that in or patch that through. But a lot of it really was, tell us your experience with the game so that we can learn from it. And that's one of the big things that we're going to be using for our next project. Is both our experience from this, and also what did people want to see more of, what do people want to see less of for these types of projects. And so a lot of it was also post content was learning. I mean, you learn a lot from your own community that decides to give your game a shot.
Okay, so final thing I'm going to ask you on the release section is, can you guys give us an estimated number of copies that you believe the Pirate's Fate sold, or is that kind of under NDA for you guys?
We're not going to answer that, but here's what I will say. We didn't do enough sales to become wealthy, but we did do enough sales to justify making another game.
That's very good to hear. I know a good majority of the games that release on Steam don't tend to make enough money to be able to make a second game, so that's very promising to hear. Next section is the retrospective. I don't really have any specific questions planned here. I more want to get a retrospective on the development of the Pirate's Fate from you guys, what you would be aiming to try to do different, what you've learned from the development of this, etc., etc.
In terms of what we learned a lot of things. It was our first experience, not just making a game, but doing anything like this at this kind of scale in this format. It's a huge undertaking, and I mean, like, from like a broad perspective, one of the biggest things that you pick up is how do you deal with high volume work. I mean, the story was almost 200,000 words long. There were a good 1,000 hard assets in this project. So it's one of those things just where you get that. On my level personally, I learned all sorts of techniques. For different types of character posing, anatomy. We released an art book, and one of the pages that I had was, look at all the different versions of, these muscular characters before I knew how to draw muscles, in the way that I ended up drawing them. Still got a long ways to go, don't get me wrong, but it is one of those things where it's just tons. You go on for an hour easily just on the stuff that we learned.
Cool. Is there anything for your next title, if you guys end up doing one, that you would like to try to do different, or you'd like to focus on compared to your development of the Pirate's Fate?
I mean, it's one of those things where if we were to do something new, obviously it varies, but one of the big takeaways was structuring the story out to have, there were some obstacles that we could have structured the story to have more depth over breadth in a way that would have been beneficial. So like little things like that. There's efficiency issues, obviously, be it what engine you pick or how you go about doing certain, like, for example, off the top of my head, when we were doing the voice acting, we had to learn what voice actors needed specifically. And because you can't give them a 200,000 word script for reading, 10 minutes of recorded dialogue and just be like, read this and learn it. That's just not fair to them. So you got to get stuff like that down, and so you can do improvements like that. And that's what I was trying to get at before, is just we learn so much. It's going to come through on these projects in all these little different ways that I think will both make us faster and more polished.
So actually, on the voice acting thing, I want to kind of transition into a question about that. I'm not totally sure about other people's opinions, but I know when I was first trying out the beta with you guys, you guys had limited voice acting in there, which was really well done. It was very nice, but it seemed like it popped up and cut away so randomly that it almost felt like, to me, at least during the beta before I realized it was more intentional, that it was a glitch or not all the voice acting was done. Did you guys learn anything about how to maybe implement that next time, so it feels a little less broken that way, if that makes sense.
I should have designed it so that there were only like voice acting for the cutscenes, but the problem is that most of the cutscenes didn't have a lot of dialogue. So I should have come up with a system as I was writing the script, and I didn't do that. And so you're right, it did feel kind of random and haphazard. So I will come up with a better system next time. I'm not necessarily sure if I'll do only talking for cutscenes or what, but I will come up with something, because it was I blame myself for that one. I didn't think it through while I was doing the writing.
Well, I know limited voice acting can always be a bit of a landmine if you're not careful with it, because if you don't illustrate that clearly enough to the player, it can feel like either there's dialogue missing or there is like broken audio. So it's an understandable issue.
Yes.
The final kind of question I want to ask you on this retrospective is, you already said that the game did well enough that you guys will be able to make a second game. But I want to know, in your guys' eyes, did the Pirate's Face perform better, worse, or about what you kind of expected it when you kind of first embarked on this project?
Well, obviously, when we first embarked on the project, we thought it was going to be free. We thought it was going to be a tiny little game, and then it ended up being a game that was a tremendous success. At the Kickstarter phase, it has, obviously, if 90% of indie games flop, we were more successful than that, and that is a great honor. We had better reviews than most games. In fact, we made a top 100 list for the month that we came out in terms of because the review score was so high. So yeah, the game received more support and more acclaim than we could have possibly imagined when we first had this idea 2 years ago. And I'm very, very grateful and honored and humbled and everything that people have reacted so warmly to it.
Okay, so that finishes up everything I kind of wanted to ask about the retrospective. So we'll wrap this interview up with just a little talk about your guys' futures plans, which is perfect because I believe you guys just announced that you are going to be releasing an expansion for the Pirate's Fate.
Yes.
Is there anything you can kind of tell us about this expansion?
It is a brand new path. It doesn't interact with the existing game in any way, but it provides a totally unique new path for the story to take, with new romances, new transformations, new plot twists, etc. So I think it'll be really fun for people to play.
Do you guys have kind of an expected date you're going to be trying to get this out the door, or is that still kind of hush hush right now till you guys have a better idea?
It's not hush hush per se. The issue is that we don't want to issue a release date until we do the beta in case something comes up. We also want to see if people like it, and if people are telling us they don't like it, then we want to spend some time maybe making some tweaks to it so that people like it more. So we don't want to say, like, I could tell you how long I think it would take to finish if I worked really hard to try to finish it, but that doesn't take in the time that may take to, make some changes.
Yeah, those unforeseen incidents.
Yeah, so we're not ready to do a release date at this time, but I will say this, that it is most of the way done.
Yep. So, if it's realistically, if people like it and there's no big hiccups, it will be sooner than later. But once we get either right before, into beta testing, we're going to start to have a soft release date, and then that'll get much more firm as time goes on.
Cool. So just to verify, I'm pretty sure this is what it is. This will be a paid expansion for the Pirate's Fate, correct?
That's probably what it's going to be. We can't say for sure because, again, we're still trying to figure out what people like about it, and if people like it, etc. So we're not entirely sure how we're going to set that up in terms of everything.
I'll put it to you this way: we want to make sure that the price reflects both the level of content and the like that it's going to have. So most likely, though, I mean, we have so much content already, written and drawn out, it's probably going to be paid content, but it won't be that
much. Okay. Final question is, beyond the expansion, are there any future plans for Fox Wright Productions at the moment?
We have some ideas brainstormed, but we're not going to share them because they're not really ready to be shared. And also, like, we're focusing on the expansion right now, and later on we'll have more stuff to share.
Very interesting. Okay. So, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Any plugs you'd like to do before we finish up here?
Yes. We are in the final phase of the voting for the Game Development World Championship. It's the fan favorite category of an award that they have. So please vote for us. You'll probably find a link in the description of this podcast or video. It just takes 2 seconds. Click on the website, click on Pirate's Fate. And yeah, if we win, I believe Volkenfox and I get to go to Finland to pick up an award. So it would be a huge honor. And thank you so much for voting for the Pirate's Fate.
And I believe voting is open until November 11th.
Perfect.
Correct.
Okay, cool. So this has been a very interesting and informative discussion with TF Wright and Volkenfox of Fox Wright Productions on their development of the Pirate's Fate. It's definitely been a pleasure being able to talk with you guys again, and I'm happy that it's done so well. If anybody listening is interested in checking out the Pirate's Fate, you can find it on Steam and the Humble Store for I believe at the time of recording it's currently on sale for $15.99, but regular price is $19.99. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for giving your time to allow me to talk with you on these things and really just get some insight on how you built this game.
Well, thank you for talking with us. It's always good to be able to share this kind of information.
Okay.